just pronounce Spartz, right? Okay. Welcome to this event at Hudson Institute. My name is Rebeccah Heinrichs. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson, and I have the privilege today of being joined by Congresswoman Victoria Spartz from Indiana. And she is the first Ukrainian-American to join us in the U.S. Congress. And she has become a leader on how the United States should be appropriately responding to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And so it is a real pleasure to have her here with me this morning. And so we're going to have a conversation about the status of the war and how the United States and NATO is responding and what we can be doing to help the situation. So Congresswoman, I thought what we would start with is you have family still in Ukraine. And so to the extent that you're able to give us a little bit of insight into how they are doing and just the general sense of what you're hearing from Ukrainians about the war and what they're saying that they need.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure joining it. The situation in Ukraine is difficult. It's a dire situation. It's a very vicious invasion. It's really not a real war. It's genocide of the Ukrainian people, and I don't use my words lightly, but it is. You know, there are a lot of cities right now under siege with no electricity, no water. They're trying to kill any person who tried to escape city. I have some family in the cities that have been bombed for 3 weeks now, nonstop. I don't even have communications with my grandma and people that take care of her, so I don't even know how they do, and no one can get into the cities, and I'm sure they're not doing very well because you can have so much of supplies. There is no water, no electricity, and it's winter. It's cold out there. So, and there are a lot of cities like that in Ukraine, probably over 1 million people right now being, encircled and really, they're trying to kill all these people. No one is willing to, they're not agreeing to having humanitarian corridors or safe passages, and not agreeing to do it. They're killing people that are trying to escape. So it's difficult. Now Kyiv is going to be under siege. It's a large city with even more population, and I think, it's getting encircled. It's not there yet, but I think it's very difficult. I maybe just, being Ukrainian born, a lot of people reaching out to me, and I was saying that it's painful for me to watch these videos and pictures of, women and children getting killed, and hear their stories and really begging for help. So, I probably get more of that. I feel sometimes, my gosh, I have to go, this is tough for me to watch all of that, not just because I'm Ukrainian born and seen all the cities, just because as a human being, it is atrocities. It's terrible, but I always think, you know what, I just watch this video. These people are living through that. And they're tough. My mom, she lives here. She talked to her neighbor now. She doesn't have communications, and her former neighbor, and she was talking to her, and she said, you know what, it's okay. Don't cry. We just want to have guns to fight. We're okay. Just give us guns to fight. And I think that is something that the will and the strength of the people, it's inspiring even for me.
And you have said that repeatedly, that the Ukrainian people are not asking for American troops to fight their fight. They're asking for weapons to fight for themselves. Can you talk about, a lot has changed even since the last Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's even, I think, a perceptible more cohesiveness with the Ukrainian people, a stronger Ukrainian identity that's very unique, uniquely Ukrainian. And a lot of the attacks, the targets from the Russians have been not just military targets, but cultural targets of Ukrainians. So kind of back to your point about it's not even just it's not a normal war. They really are trying to crush what it means to be Ukrainian. Can you give us a little bit more about that? What is the national identity like of Ukrainians? And because Americans can sometimes be confused about this. They think, well, don't Ukrainians see themselves as Russians? Or isn't there a large number of Ukrainians who see themselves as Russians? Can you give us some insight into that?
Well, it's interesting because the city of Chernihiv, actually, the Prince of Chernihiv studied Moscow as part of Kievan Rus because at that time they have got Mongols and Tatars. They were attacking them from the east, so they constantly would attack, the Kiev and Chernihiv ancient cities. So one of the prince moved the capital in Moscow and was of the founder. They even have a monument to him. So now he's bombing the city of Chernihiv for 3 weeks, destroying churches that that have centuries old, that went through all of the wars and never were destroyed. He's on purpose destroying the cultural heritage of Kievan Rus, because in reality, Russia didn't even exist before. This is a Slav tribes that created Kievan Rus, and actually Kiev was the capital. If we just go back in history, it's just a bad idea to go back and start redividing borders in Europe, because there is a lot of history. So there is that heritage that he's really trying to destroy. But unfortunately, I think it's also not the fight about him in the territory. It's a fight about the ideas and ideals. And he believes that he can suppress, and he did suppress his own people with a lot of threats and a lot of, very harsh things that he's doing. He putting people in jail and innocent. So he did it to Russians, he did it to Belarusians. They tried to do it to Ukrainians. So if you remember Orange Revolutions, they killed 100 people. Well, guess what? Millions show up next day. Well, it's very difficult to kill millions of people with police force, so now he sent an army to kill these people. So the only reason he's killing these people, because they're not willing to submit. He doesn't need territory. Look at that. He is destroying to the ground, leveling to the ground the territory. If you want to occupy and take advantage of resources, you wouldn't be leveling to the ground cities and killing civilians like that. How can you even install the government after you killed so many civilians? And I grew up in Chernihiv region, which is, very multicultural. Actually, he's killing a lot of people that are Russian-born. A lot of people in places like Chernihiv, Kharkiv, actually Russian-born people. So it's not about like Russian Ukraine. It's about he wants to kill people that do not submit to him. That is all about it. And he wants to kill as many as possible. He's not fighting the army. He wants to kill civilians. He gave an order to kill civilians, women and children, shoot them. So I think this atrocity is unbelievable, but people, even if they before, they didn't have that, like areas I grew up never was like anti-Russian or didn't even have problem. Now this, after you have your children, grandchildren dying, almost 15,000 even before this started died. Now people are definitely have this patriotic feelings, and it's like, and most of them, I grew up and it was Soviet Union, but Ukraine been independent for 30 years. A lot of these young boys and girls, they grew up, they really have no connection to Soviet Union. They're like, what in the hell are you talking about? I don't want a socialist communist. We're done. It's enough. Enough is enough. And they're willing to die for freedoms. And unfortunately, a lot of good people are dying.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually something that you have repeatedly said is actually growing up, how you grew up and where you grew up is where you actually get some of your political philosophy. And your patriotism as an American comes out of your experience, which is often the case with many American immigrants who become, American citizens here. And if you want to talk about that too, that would be great, because I know there's Ukrainian populations throughout the Midwest, and I have family also in Ohio who is Ukrainian born, and so that political philosophy. It makes sense that it comes in, what oppression is like. That's right. And so you can talk a little bit about that. And then also, while you're maybe thinking about that, the other thing I would like to hear from you is how you think the United States should view the importance of Ukraine and what the Russians are doing, and how that impacts U.S. national security.
Right. Well, and I think just to follow up, I think I didn't finish on the other questions. Ukrainians are very realistic and understand that West is not going to go fight the wars for them, but also there is some commitment that the West does have to Ukraine, and I'll tell you which commitments are. Ukraine used to be the third largest nuclear country after Russia in United States, and in 1994, United States, rightly so, push Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons, and in exchange to provided Budapest memorandums that, the sovereignty and, they will, make sure that they assure sovereignty. And I actually remember that because I still live in that country, and I went to School of Economics in that time, and we even had discussion at that time, is it really guaranteed? Did Ukraine really get this properly? And what is really they got in return? And in reality, there were no real assurance. This is a piece of paper. But it sets a very dangerous precedent, because now we're dealing with countries like Iran, and we're dealing with countries with North Korea. And then if we are going to be, a country that wants to get into some agreement and them agree, and then don't provide some way what is going to happen in return, every other country is going to think well, why should I give up my nukes, right? Like Ukraine, if they would be a nuclear country, they wouldn't have Russia now slaughtering their people. And that puts us in very bad situation where we can make war in nuclear arms race, and it's a very dangerous situation to have that. So I think there is it's not our guarantees under Article 5 NATO, right, but it's some level of assurance that we do have commitment. You cannot just be a wishy-washy wobbly country, and that's what Putin is trying to do. He's trying to embarrass us. This is a strike at the West, and United States in particular, as he considered to be leader of the West. That's just to say, oh, look at this. You got embarrassed in Afghanistan. Let's see what West is going to do. Mm-hmm. And that is a kind of, they team up with China to say, listen, you're going to be with us, follow our centuries of democracy, which is a complete joke. They say we are countries with centuries of democracy. I don't think maybe their constituency drinking Kool-Aid, but I think the rest of the world is not that dumb. But they want to show that you are with us, we'll guarantee you peace. But you go with the West, look how West is protecting Ukraine. Look what West is doing. We're going to slaughter all these people, and they're going to be watching them. So this is a strike in the world order in democracy. And it kind of shows, where is the West? What are they helping? Because I was meeting with one of the leaders in Middle East recently, and it was interesting. He said, Ukraine thought they were in the green, and now they're in the gray. And I think they are in the gray. And I think this is a big discussion for us going forward. What is our institutions providing? How we can have that stability and peace? We created United Nations. We created all these organizations. We have a major war right now in Europe, and none of them are functional. So what is the process for that? And what kind of things, can happen and need to happen to make sure that there is stability and peace, as somebody can just single-handedly go and try to slaughter a bunch of people and can escalate the conflict in much more significant. So I think West needs to get stronger. There are some things we cannot do. We cannot provide no-fly zone just because, we cannot just go and, we cannot enforce it in an effective way without getting direct conflict with, with the nuclear power. So that is not feasible. And, but there are some things that are feasible. We can help Ukrainians to, to secure their humanitarian corridors. We can have provided proper weapons that have they have ability to protect their own people. Yeah. And they understand very realistically that they will have to do it. They're not going to fall. They're not saying, this is not the people are going to say, oh, well, let's just give us some things, we're going to run away. These people fighting with nothing. But I think it's important for us to do and have some speed and scale, because in any conflict, you have to have the right strategy. You actually need to have a strategy. Unfortunately, in the West, a lot of these conflicts and problems we get in, we actually don't have a strategy. You always have to have an exit strategy too when you enter into anything and know where you want to land. And you adjust your tactics. And then you need to have speed and you need to have scale to be able to do it at much faster pace. Otherwise, it can be prolonged, and the longer things prolong, the more dangerous they become.
No, I think several wonderful points I think you just made. I focus my work here on issues related specifically to nuclear weapons, and I have been very concerned about the point that you made about the non-proliferation message that we're sending. And I actually am concerned, President Biden's emphasis that that the United States is not going to get in a direct confrontation with Russia because it would necessarily turn into World War III. I think that's a straw man that he's created because it is a nuclear power. But we do want to avoid direct military confrontation. However, that should not self-deter us from doing so much more at completely reasonable levels of escalation. And you and I have talked about some of these things, providing weapons at scale and with the right speed, and making sure that the Zelensky government is getting the right kinds of weapons. So let's talk about that. And the other thing, that the humanitarian corridor, Hudson has done, I think, great work. My colleagues, Bill Schneider, Doug Feith, and Brian Clark, have put together some ideas about how we can do the very thing you said. That it's not a no-fly zone at all, but it does enable the Ukrainian government to make sure that the humanitarian corridor is actually safe. But NATO allies can contribute in outside the borders of Ukraine to be able to do that. That's something I think that is a completely reasonable NATO mission to make sure that we can do that. What else? So we are now the United States is sending more weapons into Ukraine. Is it enough? Is your sense that it is happening at the right speed, or do you think that the administration is still a little bit too slow at getting Ukraine everything they need to put up a fight?
Well, they definitely were playing a catch-up and dragging their feet for sure, and that is not very good, because and they also do a lot of talk. Like, you don't need to say what you will not do with it. You just actually don't know what things can happen. Don't just make these categorical things that you will not do. What you need to do, you say, if this happened, I'll do this, and then do it. That's more meaningful in any deterrence and foreign policy, whether how you deal with sanctions, whether how you deal in the defensive and military strategy, right? Just say what you're going to do if this happened, and just do it. A lot of time we just talk about it before it's done, and then some is not done, and then politicizing, and this is actually very unhealthy. If you go to poker bear, you better make a strike, okay? You just don't do too much talk, because that's create a lot of danger. You put a lot of people in danger. You escalated actually the situation before it even needed to be escalated. But you need to make some points. You need to make some deterrence points. If you go too far in some of things, this is not acceptable. We are not going to accept some of the crazy things that you might thinking about it, and set that red line and follow that red line. But also, was helping with the defensive side, like they did with this mix. They politicized this issue with no reason. Yeah. And also, why do you even need to go Putin is not tweeting what his next step is going to be, or putting on national media. I mean, why would you need to go and do that before you even done it? If you want to share it, you've done something. If you believe it's necessary, which most of the time probably it's not, but even if you want to do it, well, don't say it, and then you kind of backtrack and wobbly, and you might not even do it, and then you decide, what are you trying to get his approval for that, or what? It's like a joke. I've never seen such military strategies done on national TV. I mean, it's strange to me. It's almost like this talking point signing, just a picture ops. I mean, this is a real war. This is not a picture ops theater, and it's not a political, just politicking. I mean, they're trading this like it's some political theater, which we have full of Congress, but it's a serious situation.
And it does seem that a lot of the messaging coming out of the White House is geared towards an American domestic audience, which obviously can have a negative impact on the actual war that's going on in Ukraine. And I agree, it does seem that, again, kind of back to this point, that if the administration is so afraid of a direct military confrontation, that they're trying to, communicate to the American people essentially that they're not going to go to war over Ukraine with Russia, and that's the narrative that they want. And so that's how they're communicating publicly, but then the impact is saying things like they're not going to be providing certain kinds of ISR to the Ukrainians. For a while there, they were not providing real-time targeting to the Ukrainians because they were afraid, and they would say this, that that some of what they're not willing to do it because of the concern that the Russians might call the United States a co-belligerent in this. And so, they didn't want to send the Polish MiGs, which I thought that's a decision that the United States can make privately, but it was, I thought, a mistake to say that to send the MiGs would be escalatory and high risk. If you say that, and then you tell the Poles but to go ahead and do it, you've essentially made it just impossible for Poland to do that without U.S. backing, because the Russians can now say, well, even the Americans said it was high risk and escalatory. Right. So it is an interesting point. It does seem like we could do less, we could have less public declarations of what the United States is unwilling to do, and then more of these conversations happening privately, and then just doing it so that we have maximum options, and to cause the Russians to think, maybe I shouldn't attack so close to the Polish border, near NATO missions, because it might elicit a response, even if it isn't directly in, inside Poland's territory. So that is I think that's a really great point. So this last, so President Zelensky gave addressed the Congress. I'd like to know how you thought he did and how he's doing. And then if this last, batch of weapons you think is still good, and if there are things that you are seeing from the Biden administration working with Congress that are at least encouraging to you.
Well, I just kind of even just follow up on this mixed situation. It's kind of interesting because, I read some, what Russian Minister of Defense said, and actually they said, that if we let, mixed flying to Ukraine from NATO airfields, that's escalatory. They never even mentioned that just giving it to Ukraine and somehow it's escalation. So it was interesting. They even issued a statement on that issue.
Wow.
Because I can read Russian. I know both Russian and Ukrainian, so I periodically go see what they write. But it was interesting for me to say they never even considered to be escalation. So we made it into escalation.
And then they adopted that language.
Yeah, well, and it's kind of like almost like, why we even do that? Like, that is very strange to me. We cannot be just afraid. You need to have, some strength, and you need to have some courage. If you want to deal with someone that aggressive like that, then you need to be strong. I think President Zelensky, he really stepped up to the plate, and I think his courage and what he is doing united the West more than anything else. And I think, it's an inspiration to a lot of people. I even was recently meeting with Taiwan representative, and she said, we're nervous what's happening, but it's really strengthened and inspired people in our country. And we feel like we can be strong, we will be strong. I think the actions of Ukrainian people inspiration to a lot of people. I was always saying this reminds me of the founding of our country, and unfortunately it takes, a lot of blood to gain freedom, so it's better not to give it up. I always tell my children, you'll have a lot of fights to fight, but remember, don't give up your freedom, because there are a lot of people that died for them and for you, and just keep them, because otherwise our children and grandchildren will have to die then to keep it, and we don't want to go there. But it's a very vivid example how hard it is, the freedoms are, and how hard to get them. So I think President Zelensky, it's good that he's getting, not just talking to all presidents and everyone, but he actually gets to the people. He talks to Congress, we're the people's house. We are influenced with people. We're influenced by constituencies. So having direct messages to Congress is very important. And I think Congress, it being united in a lot of ways is not in a lot of other issues. We do need some unity, actually, because we have a lot of problems that we need to deal with, and we need to have some common sense and not drama BS that we do and talking about nothing in this committee, because there are some serious issues internally we have in the country. So I think that is very positive for us at least to see some of that, and put pressure on the administration, because we are co-equal branch. We actually first among equals. We have a power of purse and power of war. This is a pretty significant powers were given us by founding fathers, and we have been reluctant to exercise our powers effectively. And I'm not saying because I have a Democrat president. I had a Republican governor when I was state senator, and we were not on the same page a lot of times. So I challenge anyone, because my job is to represent the people and be check and balance to executive branch and have accountability, because they executives are supposed to execute what we ask them to do and be accountable to us on the execution. They shouldn't be legislating, creating policy, making decisions. We are actually given the power and authority to do that, and they execute what we want to do. But unfortunately, we did not set up proper mechanism, or erode it in a lot of ways, where we do have that oversight function, and they have to care what they do, not just send some stupid responses on our letters about nothing, and pawn it, and this, you send all this letter. I'm like, I'm done with all of these letters. Like, this is like a bureaucracy pages that they just send you junk responses. They don't care what you send to them. They should care, because if they don't do it, well, you know what? we can deny them funding. And if we would be using that, that is the biggest string we have that are given to us, and we have not been exercising it.
And I am curious too, when you mentioned constituents and really members of Congress are responding to what their constituents want, and there's been a lot of Americans inspired by President Zelensky. When you go back home to Indiana and you talk to your constituents, what are they saying about this war? And do they agree with you that they recognize that Russia is a threat, and that the United States, not being directly involved, in combat, but that we should be helping the Ukrainians fight, and we have to be sending a message that the Russia can't simply just maraud across Eastern Central Europe, and that he must be stopped. Do they get that, and is that important to them?
Well, I think, people are very disturbed. I have so many people in my district very disturbed what's happening. And I think, Americans are very good-hearted, strong, and generous people. And seeing this atrocity, and God-loving people, people are really shocked. We actually have a lot of churches in my district that had a lot of direct relationship with Ukrainian churches. So they get a lot of people from Ukraine writing them too directly. And people are very, very concerned. People also understand that they're fighting the fight for all of us. And really what the freedoms are, they're a bastion of this East-West philosophy. And they, and if they don't win, there is no chance for people in China or Belarus to win, or people like in Cuba, if they are not winning this battle, there is no chance for the rest of the world to become free, because this is a big message which can, good, win against evil. And, so I think a lot of people are very concerned. A lot of people feel that we need to do a better job in the government, and administration need to do things much faster. You always have a diversity in opinion, and that's okay. We even have it in Congress. That's okay. We're a very diverse country, but this is by far the most united issues that I've seen even in my district.
Yeah.
And people, and this is the people that probably some of these people never even heard about what the difference between Russia and Ukraine, and now they're very stressed out. So I think people are very concerned about that, and I think we've done some things, but we're very slow in responses. And to your question earlier, you mentioned, is it enough, not enough? I think the faster we act, the more, we put pressure on Russia to get to the negotiation table, the more likely things can happen, because the longer the conflict prolongs, the more bad things can happen. It can escalate, the dangers posing, being on the border of NATO and drag us into that indirect, contact. It's becoming higher. The danger of, not be able, more people are going to die, and, for Ukrainians, it will already a lot of them, it's a disaster, but the more people die, the much harder it's going to be for Ukrainians even to be able to agree to anything with them, and it really brings into more escalation, more different type of weapons. So I think we need to strike, very seriously from a sanction front, help Ukrainians to defend, beef up our eastern flank, and then drag Russians to the table and say, enough is enough. And let's, work with Ukraine and find an agreement to resolve this situation, because it's not going to be good for you, the worst for you, and it's not good for anyone. And this conflict, it's a very serious. So I think right now, I don't think they have an honest desire to do that. They sent in some former Minister of Culture to negotiate the agreement, it's a joke. But I think, the more pressure they feel, the more likely they're going to be at the table.
And I know there's, I've noticed people in the media saying that, the U.S. NATO side, Ukrainian side needs to be looking for an off-ramp for Russia. But Russia doesn't want an off-ramp yet. There's been no indication that the Russians are in any way earnest about their desire for any kind of political settlement at this point. And 2 points. One, I thought you raised a great point about beefing up really what I see as effectively the front of NATO right now, which is Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and that whole area. And we're sending, there's even more U.S. troops that are being shifted from the West over there, which I think President Biden was wise to make that decision, and other kinds of military deployments. Do you see what's happening now? As you said, we should have done a lot of this earlier, because perhaps we could have caused Putin to decide this isn't going to be worth it? Because he didn't do it last year, he didn't do it 2 years ago, he did it now, thinking that maybe this was the opportunity to do it. So do you think there's a lesson there that we need to be doing much more, and not just for a year, but in a permanent status, we need to have a stronger NATO in the front of NATO, meaning those, and that needs to stay there. They need to step up, and I mean, the Poles have been great at contributing to collective defense, the Romanians, but there needs to be more. We see the Germans now are contributing more to defense. Do you see all of that as, are you encouraged that that might be a more permanent situation for Europe, that Europe might actually end up safer once we, hopefully, Lord willing, get to the end of this horrible war sooner rather than later?
Yeah, I think Europe is learning a lesson. I think they understand the serious of situation, and I think they will definitely reassess what they're doing, and what they were doing, they were mistaken. Now they're going to be understand and do a better job. But we also need to think about it, how we can have more agilities to responses to crisis, because we don't need to keep all of these troops everywhere and have all of this. It's actually very exhausting for everyone and for families and everything. We don't need to have, but we need to have an agility to understand if crisis happens, and that's happened in March, we should have started doing some things to show that we mean business. We should have sent these people to the front lines there. We should send, move people from Germany, what do we have, send these weapons, and that's like, hey, we need business, because, Putin, he's not dumb, okay? He understands that West been dealing with a lot of drama, it weak in a lot of ways, doing a lot of stupid stuff about nothing. He's an opportunist. He understood there is an opportunity for him where he's politically driven, where there are a lot of decisions done based on politics, where people are exhausted in America with endless war, which, we did. I mean, we exhausted ourselves, nation building. We should never even have gone there in Afghanistan. It was just completely dumb to do that for us. You need to have a strategy, decide what to do, and pulled out. So you need to be much more agile and responsive and know what to do, and not drag yourself into things that it's unfeasible, even impossible pretty much to accomplish. And so I think he understood all of these things. So he understood that the reaction is going to be, not as strong. I think he underestimated the Ukrainian people. I think President Biden underestimated the Ukrainian people and people around him. But I think, we could have done much more to send a clear message that we mean business. With all of the things that people don't like about President Trump, one thing that he was very good at foreign policy, and he actually had a very success with Abraham protocols and how he dealt with North Korea and other things, and including Russia. When they were trying to do sense of Syria, he sent a clear message that his Tomahawks are going to be flying on a base with Russians out there. He was unpredictable. He had a backbone, and you never knew what he was going to do or tweet tomorrow. This is a very good deterrence, to any aggressor in any foreign policy, because they understand that, who knows, you might actually do something. And then do you want to screw around with that? Probably not, And I think in a lot of ways, you need to have that agility and strength, and peace through strength. It's the most effective way to keep peace, and we need to show that. And I think what we've done in Afghanistan, it made a lot of our NATO allies doubt, and they were like, okay, the United States is really the leader of the free world. Are we willing, to put our money where our mouth is? And I think, everyone was doubting. He was trying to take advantage of this situation and not doing any action, just doing a lot of talk. He was like, well, they're going to be doing a lot of talk. I think West got more united. I think West is learning a lesson. Unfortunately, it will be a high cost for Ukraine to do that. But I think we have to reassess the situation and have that ability to deal with these crises in a more effective way and in more proactive, not reactive way. We need to know the strategy. We need to know what needs to happen to deter things like that. What we've done, everything we've done was just really awkward and counterproductive.
And I think your point about Afghanistan is so important for people to understand better as well, because a lot of national security scholars would like to say that there's no connection between Afghanistan and what's going on in Europe, and then there'll be no connection to anything that happens in the Indo-Pacific or anything else. But it's impossible not to connect them, because when I have meetings with allies, that's what they want to talk about, U.S. commitments. But I want to kind of dig down a little bit and try to understand it better, because you said, the Afghanistan war was popular at the time, but then you made the interesting point. The thing that was fatiguing to Americans, though, was how protracted it was, and how the nation building, rather than just killing terrorists and going out and leaving, or just killing terrorists and keeping the mission very, very narrow and specific, so we had a clear military end state that we could look to, and then it was that withdrawal and the way that our country withdrew from Afghanistan. And it kind of gets back to this theme we had mentioned before about the lack of this administration's willingness to adapt to the changing circumstances. It's really inflexible. It makes a decision that we're not going to go to war in Ukraine, and so it's very inflexible in what it is willing to do to adapt to certain circumstances. And we saw that characteristic play out in the Afghanistan withdrawal. Do you see when the Afghanistan withdrawal was happening, was your sense it was the way it was happening and the lack of coordination with NATO? I mean, did that kind of give you a sense of how, foreboding that more bad things are going to happen? Is that kind of the sense you got and your constituents?
For sure, because, it shows our weaknesses. It shows that we are not, in our lives, that doubting us. We are not standing with our allies. I mean, we abandoned our NATO allies there that were backing us. We cannot withdraw that quickly. And I think it's interesting, because I think it's purely because people who are running the country, that they're just really been in politics all their life. So they're all afraid to say that, well, I was wrong, I need to adjust your strategy. In life, they always say, like, successful manager, if 50% is right, on your first time when you're making a decision, you adjust your strategy. You have a strategy, you adjust your action. Things always go wrong. It's to be able to figure out when things go wrong, how to adjust to still achieve what you want to achieve. This is how life is. This is like a common sense in business, in anything. That's how you deal with. In politics, we have a bunch of people that spend all their life in politics. So they don't ever make decisions. They don't have a toughness to make decisions. And they don't even understand. They say, hey, you know what? We have to adjust this decision. We have to come to the result. And they're afraid to say, well, we're going to adjust the strategy because circumstances changes. Because they're just political people. And that is very dangerous for the country when we have a pure politicians who spend their lives politicking, worrying about the polls, running the country. And we need to think twice before we elect people like that. Because this is executive position. In legislative branch, you can complain all the time and blame other sides nonstop, okay? That's what we do most of the time. But when you're an executive, when life and death situation happen under your watch, you have to be able to make these decisions. You have to be able to make tough decisions and adjust and have an ability to really, adjust your strategy and come to the, to the good results. But I think Afghanistan, it was in a lot of ways, it's also a good lesson for us to say you cannot build a nation for someone else. You can help good people if people want to build a nation, if people are willing to fight for freedoms themselves, to help them, because, to build their nations in indirect way, but only people of that country can build their country. You cannot change mentality, you cannot change the people, and it's a stupid idea to even to do that, to drag yourself and think that you can actually do that. It's good for us to promote this democracy, because it's good and safe for us. The more democratic countries we have around the world in our lives, it's good for us and peace that we don't have to send our children to die. Because unfortunately, we will, if the wars escalate further and further, any war, we get dragged into that. So it's good for us to promote that. But we cannot be fighting for these people. If people of Ukraine are willing to die and willing to fight for their own freedoms, there is a hope for these people. But if people of Afghanistan are not willing to do it, you cannot force them to do it. And you shouldn't be. And you shouldn't make decisions for them like that. Because it's very draining for us, but it's also not necessary. And our children shouldn't be dying for countries that don't want that or don't have even basis for that. So I think it was a major mistake to go where we went, but hopefully we learned from some of these mistakes. And it was major mistakes how we mishandled Ukraine in a lot of ways too, because we could have done much more to deter it from where it ended up being.
And you made a nice point too. The last administration's approach, there's this idea, and I think that maybe some in this administration kind of have this idea that strength itself is provocative, and that strength, military strength, economic strength, actually prevents us from being able to have diplomatic openings. But the last administration actually, they kept Nord Stream 2 forbidden, and sanctions on Nord Stream 2. Sanctions against the Russians for the things that they did in the U.S. election, all kinds of things that were, supported the 3 Cs initiative, American energy independence, nuclear modernization, which the Russians opposed, pulled out of arms control treaties that the Russians were cheating on. They did all of these things that were actually good for the U.S., tough on Russia, and at the same time desired diplomatic, opportunities. And so really, I think you nicely kind of laid out that these things can go hand in hand. You can have tough strength with an open hand of diplomacy, and that oftentimes if you're not tough, you actually just end up getting your lunch eaten from the person who's tougher than you are.
That's right. There is not going to be happening any diplomacy if you don't back it up with some, strengths militarily and just so you mean business. I think that comes hands in hands. Otherwise, these aggressors don't want to negotiate with you because they feel they can take advantage of you. And I think that's extremely important.
That's so well said. Well, I could talk with you for another hour, but I know that you've got some legislative business to get to. Congresswoman, we are all better for having you in Congress, especially now at this time, and learning from you. And so we thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much. And I appreciate that we have so many freedom-loving people in our country that very inspired what's happening. And I just hope that this is a great lesson for us, especially for young people, to really learn, what it takes to keep freedoms, how much, how many people are dying, and had died before. And I hope that will maybe make a lot of our young people more mature and grow up and start thinking about things that are important. And also maybe our Congress grow up a little bit too. We can use a little bit more common sense and maturity too. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us here at Hudson Institute.
Okay, we're good?